Okay, cool.
Okay, shall we start?
Please start.
Great. Welcome everyone to today's Designing Dialogue. Today's Zoom will be about an hour with a 45 minutes long conversation followed by Q&A. We'll be recording this for archive purpose and we'll put them on Vimeo shortly after each episode. We are also muting everyone to ensure audio clarity. So if you want to ask Najla any questions during the conversation, please, we encourage you to type them down in the chat box in advance so we can go through them during the Q&A. And now let's turn to our host, Glenn Adamson.
Thank you, Lucy. Najla, welcome to the Design and Dialogue series.
Hi, Glenn.
Just to repeat one important thing that Lucy just said, if you do have a question for Najla, just put it into the chat box anytime and then we'll pick those questions up in the last 15 minutes of the chat. But let's go ahead and kick it off. First, Najla, just can you tell the audience where you are and what the scene is like?
So I'm home and I'm in my room. I have two children, so I'm trying to hide from them. Yeah, so I'm in my room
Okay,
with all of you guys.
If they make a guest appearance, they'll be very welcome. The complexion of the conversation.
That will become complicated, yes.
But it's interesting to be talking to you from Amsterdam because, of course, you were in Beirut for years, and when we first met and started talking about your work, the context of producing in Beirut was very important. So just before we start the images, which we will in a second, I would just wonder if you could say a little bit about what your journey has been. So very briefly, France, Lebanon, and now Amsterdam.
So I grew up in France, in Paris, and so I grew up there. We arrived there when I was about 2 years old, and then I left France when I was 25, just after graduating, or 26. And then I moved to the Netherlands. I worked in the Netherlands for about 2 years, and then I moved to Lebanon. And now I'm in Amsterdam. I'm back to the Netherlands. So the reason why I went to Lebanon is because I'm Lebanese originally, and I wanted to discover my country and get to know my country, a place that I visited a few times every year to visit family, but I never really lived there. And so I thought it was a good time to move to this wonderful place and to Beirut and take it step by step. And then it turned out to be quite a fruitful stay in many different ways. And I stayed there for about 10 years. And now I'm in Amsterdam since August.
And before we talk about the work that you developed and your time in Beirut, can you just briefly say what the art scene and design scene in Beirut were like? Because I think a lot of listeners will not have visited in person. I haven't visited Beirut in person, and just kind of wonder what the texture of the creative community there is like.
So first and foremost, Beirut is a very complex city. So it's a city that is extremely interesting in many different ways and different layers. This, I think, created quite an important art scene that has always been there. And that has been developing over the years, and the design scene has been developing quite recently, I must say. I think maybe just before I arrived to Lebanon, and has proven to bloom in a very quick way with many interesting talents. That has
So it was sort of on the upswing while you were there, which is interesting. And
yeah, definitely, yes.
Sure.
Definitely.
Were you quite clear in your mind that you were in fact setting out to be a designer when you reached Lebanon, or were you still thinking, am I an artist? Am I a designer? What's the genre of my work?
Um, uh, uh, I think I studied in France. I studied at École Camondo, which is interior design and design. Well, I would call it more spatial design and design school. It's a great school, but it's also a conceptual school. So they form their students to think conceptually by taking different, different aspects of what design means in terms of space and objects. So I was formed in a way where I didn't think of design necessarily to serve one specific function, let's say. And then after graduating, I experimented in different fields. So I was really looking and searching myself what I wanted to do. So I did many different things, from experimental cinema to working with architectural think tanks, urban think tanks. And then when I arrived, and then that was during the Netherlands. And then when I came to Beirut, I wanted to get closer to what I really wanted to do, which was something between design and space, but I didn't really, I couldn't really tackle what it was. And the city really inspired me at that time. And I felt the need to, get closer to something that was part of me, but that I didn't know particularly well. So things really developed naturally, I would say.
Well, that seems like a great lead into the first couple of images that we have. So maybe Lucy, you could put those up. Speaking of nature, because there definitely was a quality of natural forces present in some of the work that you did. For example, the installation that you did at the V&A, which I'm not sure that we have. Do we have the images of that, Lucy, or are we leaping right to Distortion? But maybe you could just describe briefly the V&A installation of the pinwheels.
Yeah, of course. I was commissioned by the V&A for the London Design Festival back in 2013, I think. And I was invited by Salma Toukan, who was back then one of the curators of the Middle Eastern department of the V&A. And she invited me. The London Design Festival invited me to do whatever I wanted to do at the V&A, which was really something quite prestigious for a young designer and quite challenging as well. So I visited the V&A a few times, and I fell in love with the medieval and Renaissance gallery, and I created a large door of 8 meters high, which was the aim was really to design wind and work with a material that I consider being wind. And be able to work with that, to be able to translate different emotions, and basically tell the story of that specific location of the V&A, which has a particular story to its architecture. So yes, that was my first experience in trying to give something invisible visibility.
So I just did put in the link to the V&A project there, and that certainly brought into your work issues of ephemerality and the kind of conditioning of space through object design and through the kind of, I want to say, kind of minimal gesture that produces a maximal psychological effect. And that might be one point of continuity between that early project and the Distortion benches, which we're looking at now, which ultimately became part of this exhibition transition that we'll talk about over the course of this conversation. So this is a series of benches in fiber reinforced resin concrete, each of which features this kind of bulge or swell or promontory, not sure exactly what the right word to use would be. And there's a lot that can be said about this body of work. I wonder first if you could just tell us a little bit about the genesis of the basic idea of this design, these slab benches with this gentle convex form that emerges from them above or below.
Yes. So distortion. So these bench. I will talk about the transition exhibition in general, and then present the fact that we had 3 series that fit the transition, because the distortion benches also are part of a whole of a general story. So for my exhibition with Friedman Benda back almost a year ago, more than a year ago, was called Transition, and I had 3 series: Distortion, Fragmented Pillar, and Seduction. So Distortion was the first series that I developed, part of the transition theme, and it's a series of benches that talk about a specific emotion that I personally went through, which related to space and to the body and to the touch and to the self, actually. So I created 12 benches, but then we actually produced, I think, 5 of them. And each bench really puts in stages, actually, a specific time of that transition, actually distortion story within the transition. And it talks about the transformation of the body and different types of contradictions, and it talks about the separation, actually, because the bench is, a bench is a function that is made for more than one person. So I was interested in talking about an object that would receive more than one person on it and be used by more than one person, and so each people sitting on the bench would experience something differently.
So in the case of this one, for example, Distortion 10 that we're looking at, you, of course, if you're a single sitter, you have a choice as to where to put yourself. So you can either be a stable, wider surface on the left side of the bump, or you can park yourself way out on that cantilever in this much more precarious seeming position. And of course, if you had 3 sitters, let's say, one of them might be on the right side, and so in that position of isolation.
But the focus was always, with these benches, the focus was always on the person who would be apart.
Right.
So the distortion is actually creates that separation, and this is where the theme of isolation is represented. And it's really about that singular person next to the rest of the people sitting on that bench, and it's the experience of that.
And by Asian people in general, of course.
Yeah,
it's at least a double meaning, that term distortion in the title. It's the distortion of the form, so you have this very pure, minimal white form that has a physical distortion in it. You also have this concept of what we might call psychological distortion, or a psychological change, perhaps, and those two things are mapping each other or indexing one another in some way. Does that sound sort of right?
Yes, correct. So that distortion series was actually a way to express my own relationship with my own body. So it was my first pregnancy, and but it's not necessarily related to the pregnancy. Of course, the distortions, the bumps do relate to that, but it's really about the contradictions between this swell, this bump, with a very rectilinear, regular and sharp shape. So it was really a way of expressing different types of contradictions. And my own feeling actually during that period where it was a distortion of the reality really, and how the body was changing little by little, and losing control of that body, and the isolation that was felt with that specific feeling, not only isolation of my own self with my body, because they were two, I mean, the body does his own thing, and then there was me, and not understanding what was necessarily happening or where things were going, and but also isolation in terms of who I am as a woman, and also as an artist, and yeah, so the distortion is really more complex about it talks about different types of emotions, and so that's why there are different types of benches that tries to represent these different stages within one specific series.
So you have a very subtle calibration of the exact nature of each composition. So for example, Lucy, if you go to the one where the bump is on the underside, before we get to this table, this one, for example, has an entirely clean surface.
So yes, so the
use of negative space in the composition.
Yes, but also this bench talks about weight, and talks about this this feeling that so the surface, actually the top surface seems to be completely flat. However, if you sit over the bump, the surface is actually retracted because of the weight of the bump. I mean, that's the way I wanted to express it, which means that you're sinking in, and yeah. So that was for this specific bench. It was actually talking about the weight of that transformation on someone and on oneself, and.
So you said something really interesting that I wanted to come back to just a minute ago, Najla, which is that during the experience of pregnancy, and I don't want to associate the form of the bench too closely to the physical pregnant body, because I realize it's a much more complicated image than that. It's not just a depiction of female pregnancy. But you said that you had an experience, and I'm sure this is something a lot of women would say who have gone through pregnancy, that the body seems simultaneously of course you, but also external to you, because it has its own things that it's doing that you're experiencing for the first time. And I wonder whether there's also something in this piece, in this series, about the objects as something both external to you and also something that you're creating. So there's this another contradiction where it's both something outside and inside at the same time. Do you see what I mean? In addition to the rectilinear.
No.
Well, or in addition
what do you mean?
So in addition to the rectilinear versus curved opposition, or hard soft, or social and isolated, so we have all these different contradictions that are, but then there's also this idea that the body is both something you experience from the outside and something that is an object. Sorry, something you experience from the inside psychologically, but also an object that you see from the outside. Because to me, these benches are kind of like bodies in that way, and they seem both psychological and, and physical. And that seems like another very active contradiction in the series.
Yes, maybe, actually, maybe. Now, for me, these objects were, they were really a way to be able to put, basically these objects were my words, it was a way to be able to understand what was happening, to experience these objects the way I experienced it within my own body. So yes, I think it makes sense what you're saying.
Just one last question about this series before we move on. This is maybe a hard question, but do these look different to you now because we're in this lockdown situation and we're all thinking about isolation? Is it fair to?
No, I think they're quite relevant, actually, to the situation of isolation specifically. Now I think more. I would say the bench number 12, which is the only bench that is a bench made for one person. I think is really more representative. But yes, because also these benches have this this contradiction in terms of something extremely rectangular, quite sharp, yet the swell is very sensual and comforting in a way. So I don't know about how other people are living it, but in my case, we do have this contradiction of this kind of daily frustration, yet a daily comfort and happiness versus anxiety. I mean, I'm spending time with my kids. I never saw my kids as often as I am now, and this gives me a lot of comfort. Yet I'm extremely anxious about just being able to break my routine, actually.
Yeah, it probably gives them a lot of comfort too to have so much time with their parents, I'm sure.
Yes, for sure.
This thing of the swell form in the Distortion series, that bump is both the thing that separates you and the thing that comforts you. That's very interesting, because
yes,
it makes you think, well, what else in life is like that? Of course, we're experiencing this right now in a very unusual way, but often maybe the things that make us feel safe are the things that end up isolating us. So there's a kind of a very subtle, nuanced observation there. Lucy, can you go ahead to the table Ballon? So this is well, to me, it seems like a very closely related object, but you tell me, a table that relates to the Distortion series, but has a slightly different expression of the vocabulary. So I wonder if you could talk about this more kind of large scale version.
So that was a private commission, actually, and the Ballon is basically a table. It's a very intimate table for 10 people. So I tried, because with my clients who really wanted to create this kind of intimacy, actually, on her dining table, I wanted to, as much as possible, to be able to create an environment where people are extremely close to each other, yet there is another person present. I mean, I won't say person, but there's a landscape around this,
like a presence. Yeah,
there is a presence, and the relation with that presence is different, actually, for everyone who's sitting around that table. So it was it looks a bit, of course it's familiar to the Distortion series, but I think it's different in terms of what it was aiming to represent, or to achieve, at least. And as much as the swells, I think, have a certain presence, actually, well, now that I think about it, because the swells do insist on the fact that this person who's away and who's separated in isolation does exist, and yeah, so the Ballon, I think, would join the Distortion series in this way, but the aim was really to be able to create intimacy, and to be able to create intimacy around the landscape, which is a table that's blowing.
One thing that occurs to me about this particular design, and I think it's true of the other benches as well, is that there's a way in which you're challenging this long-standing tradition that radical design has to be anti-functional or non-functional. So this is a very, very familiar idea that a piece of furniture or ceramic object or textile hanging, whatever it is, can be distorted such that it becomes an artwork because of its lack of functionality. So it loses its functionality, so it becomes a sculpture like Presto, a very simple idea. And I feel like what you're doing is very interesting in relationship to that whole trajectory, because you're making the table kind of differently functional. I mean, you wouldn't normally think you'd want to have a big bulge in your table to have dinner, but then because it's there, it changes the nature of that dinner, so it simply reshapes the functionality of the object and the social situation it generates, rather than contradicting functionality in a more straightforward kind of dialectical oppositional way.
Yes, I agree. But I also think that function, the way I use function, is really a tool of expression.
Yeah.
So as much as material is important and proportions, function is as important, but only under the aim of expressing something.
Yeah, I like that. I just put that in the chat, the way I use function as a tool of expression, because I think that's a very key aspect of your work. Maybe because the time's getting on already, my goodness, it's almost 11:30. Let's get on to the Seduction series. It's a very ambitious series of forms that have to do with interlacing, and I think really bring out also that narrative quality that you already talked about with Distortion, but is maybe even more palpable here. So can you talk about this second of the three groups, please?
Okay, so actually, if we talk chronologically speaking, I would say that the Seduction is really the third of the three groups.
Yeah.
In
terms of when
yeah.
You wrote them, that's true.
No, development, and also I think. Well, yes, actually, no, you're right. You're right. It mixes with the second series. But yes, so Seduction, the Seduction series talks about two bodies that are slowly getting to know each other again. And they start by being apart, quite cold, quite shy, and I won't say shy, actually. It's more dramatic than that. Anyways, and then little by little the bodies get closer and discover themselves.
Najla, can I push you on that word? So you say not shy, but what would be the right word? Like alienated or detached or?
I think probably alienation is the right word. Yes.
Okay, and so that's this. I want to call it the first pair. Maybe that's too simplistic, but
yes,
this first pair M and F that we're seeing here. So they're not in contact at all.
They're not in contact at all. They're completely separated. They're also conceived in an Italian travertine, which was also very important to me as a material, because it's a very textured material and very cold material, not only to the touch but also to the way it's sculpted. So it's actually an extremely difficult material to sculpt because of the veins, and the process of the sculpting I think is as important as the pieces themselves to be able to make them. So yes, so there are two bodies that are separated, and one is the male, so M, who's confident and who's in movement, actually, because this is a rocking stool. So when you sit on it, it moves. And the other one is F, and F is close to is folding. It's a body that's folding and close to itself, and not in movement and not ready to open up at all. So yeah.
But also,
so that's the first stage.
Also, therefore, very stable. So you have one rocking form that's kinetic and another that's extremely static.
Correct.
We could say in a more positive way that very
even I think fossilized would be the right word. Yeah.
Great word. Yeah. I'm also interested that this Italian travertine, at least for me, has very strong associations to certain kind of architecture that's very stately, and you used the word cold earlier. and I guess cold sounds like a negative word, but also you could say a kind of austerity, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
I think of Italian
Yeah,
modern
definitely.
often. And so it's a very specific material with a very strong architectural set of associations for me.
I agree with you. And as a material, it's a very, very loud material. I mean, it's a very present material. It's extremely textured, and it's extremely present even as a block. You know, so because you have certain stones that don't really have they don't have as much presence as travertine would when it's not worked upon. So definitely travertine has it wasn't a coincidence basically to make these pieces in travertine. And yeah.
So then we have this very strong contrast, of course, both materially with the Niwala sandstone, which is a very different material to work, has a different surface quality, but also clearly now these two bodies have assumed a totally different configuration. So can you tell me where the story goes next?
So so this is Seduction pair 1, and so these two bodies are joined and are embracing each other, as well. In comparison to Seduction F and Seduction M from their title, there is a specific allocation to the gender, whereas Seduction pair 1 and all the rest of the seductions, you don't really. I didn't want to give any more importance to the gender, because the gender can be either or. But the two bodies are red. Also, these are two blocks of stone that have been sculpted separately, and even within the process, they had to join each other. And so I'm insisting on the process, because the process I think is more than ever important in that project and in the theme. Because it was really a challenge to put them together, and I think in the same way as this happened, it was quite a challenge to put these two bodies together. So
the process and the materiality becomes so symbolic or resonant or in tune with the ideas behind the work, and they seem to map onto one another so completely. And I think and we'll have some process shots in a minute coming up, but I think particularly of that line that's on the right hand side of this image, where there's the two pieces are kind of snuggled together in this very tight arc.
Tight, but not that tight. Actually, there's a certain contrary to Seduction F and M. There's much more of a relaxed gesture here, and I won't say necessarily sensual. Actually, it's more comforting and more at peace and at ease.
Yeah, I shouldn't say tight, I should say close, but that feeling
yeah,
these two almost,
and in movement as well. Yeah.
And am I right in thinking that this is the piece from the series that was acquired by the Dallas Museum?
Correct.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about that context, because it was also shown in an exhibition of female designers, but both shown in that show and then acquired.
Yes, so I was commissioned by the Dallas Museum of Art to actually make that piece for the exhibition, and also to be part of their permanent collection. So I was lucky enough to have been introduced by the gallery to Sarah Schluning, and the models were there, the concepts were there, but there was no object design produced yet. They were designed and thought through, but not produced yet. And it was extremely challenging, because it was way before the exhibition, and I had very little time to be able to conceive that piece, to be part of that show, and so it was an incredible process, and we made it. So I would like also to insist that this was produced in Lebanon with amazing Lebanese craftsmen. And so yes, did I answer your question? What was your question?
Well, I partly was asking because we're going to have Sarah Schleining on the series,
okay,
Design and Dialogue series. So I just wanted to foreshadow that to some extent. But
yeah.
also that story that you just told about producing the work under some time pressure and in Lebanon for display in America, it really highlights some of the both the pressures that you're under producing this work, but also the cosmopolitan context for its production. But let's go on through the rest of the Seduction images quickly. Just to give a sense of what the range of the forms that you generated were. And these, of course, were generated both at this larger scale as seating, but also as lamps, as we saw at the beginning, and in a wide variety of different stones. Do you want to talk about just this last form, pair 6, before we move
on? So pair 6, actually these pieces, contrary to Distortion, actually were numbered from when they were produced, whereas Distortion were numbered they were relevant to when they were thought, in terms of stages, in terms of chronology. So this was chronology of production and not chronology of thinking process or the actual events.
Or narrative. That's really important because it's potentially confusing because you'd think pair 1 comes before pair 6. But it's actually the sequence of production. So it's important to know that. So what does this suggest to you? I mean, for me, I sort of feel like the form that's underneath reminds me of Seduction F from the first one we saw. It seemed, but now sideways in a different configuration.
So the series starts with Seduction F and M, and Seduction 6 comes right after, I would say. And then it's important to see the series as a whole because the stones also change in colors and in textures. So we saw Seduction pair 1, which is made in a Niwala sandstone, which is I would say a more silky type of stone. I mean, not silky; it's actually more textured. But anyway, it's more homogeneous. And Seduction pair 6 is the meeting is when Seduction F and M meet. They're still in travertine, yet the addition of color warms things up, I would say. And suddenly, yes, the there's I'm not sure you would say that flush, no, not flush or flesh. So F has more body and is revealing her shapes, and so you already understand from the gestures, although we are still in a travertine materiality, the gestures are more organic and more relaxed. M has also taken a more, is still quite confident, I would say, but is more at ease as well. So this is the stage before they get even closer. So this is the first connection.
I love the way that you talk about these pieces of stone, which of course are actually inert, just physical matter that's been given shape. I love the way that you talk about them as characters having states of mind, like he feels like this, she feels like that. And it does really come across when you're standing in front of these things, and hopefully even in these images, you get a very, very strong sense of psychological state from them. Let's move on, Lucy, to the last of the 3 series. So we have these fragments, which are almost like the constituent elements or components, and then we have the fragmented pillars, which is the vocabulary sort of in its full development.
Mhm.
And please walk us through this. But one thing that I found very interesting about these three groups when shown together is that each of them presents an image that at first seems kind of obvious, like a pregnant belly or bodies relating to each other or pillars as one might find in architecture or an architectural ruin. But then there's also a sense that you're undercutting and challenging and displacing those immediate associations into a more complex array of associations. So how does that work in the case of the fragmented pillars, and how do they relate to architecture? How do they relate to the body?
So fragmented pillar, basically in terms of concept and the thinking process, I was trying to represent well, the reason why they're called fragmented pillars is because for me the pillar is really what represents the foundation of a building and the foundation of oneself. And they're fragmented, which means that they're fragilized. So if
Fragilized,
yeah,
good word.
fragilized is the word. So so they're standing, they're still standing tall, but they're in movement, and you have one would have the feeling that if you touch it, it would fall apart.
Yeah.
So it's extremely fragile, and they're conceived in plaster mixed with sand, and that was quite important to me in terms of using that specific material, because and also these pieces were sculpted, and then molds were taken out of the sculpture and then casted in plaster and sand. So every time we would cast one piece, we wouldn't necessarily have every time the same result, which means that the material is also quite unpredictable. So that was important to me. And
when you see them up, because in the pictures they seem very kind of white and clean.
Yeah, it doesn't give justice to what they are. I mean, it's very difficult to take white objects in pictures. Anyone would know, but
if you touch them, I'm doing this
if you touch them, they're slightly textured, but I would say they're smooth. They're quite smooth, but still the material is uneven and the surface is uneven. They're not completely white, just like the distortion as well. They're more even than the pillars, but they're still quite uneven. So there is this idea of movement with the materiality of it.
One question that would be fair to ask about these, because they're couched in the context of this design exhibition, and they are functional in the sense that you can sit on the fragments, and there could be kind of seating sculpture. But the taller pillars really do come across as sculpture, and they feel like Brancusi, perhaps, or other sculptors might leap to mind. And they do have a kind of anthropomorphism or gynopomorphism, so they look like bodies, perhaps as well.
Oops. Oh, sorry, I don't know what happened. Wait, let me come back to you. I think I'm back. Yes.
Better than ever.
Yes. So
the sculptural quality.
So actually, these pieces at the very beginning, I wanted to make them as lamps, and then during the process and the production and the development of these little models, because I conceive everything in model. I realized that the function in that specific case was not serving the expression of the story, and so they turned out to be purely just sculptures. So yes, and then you have the fragments, and actually the fragments are either low tables or can be used as seats. And these are directly casts from the actual pillars. So that was also important to me, to take out these fragments and to place them separately.
Like they wandered off on their own, or something. Yeah. Can I ask you sort of the same question? And actually, this will have to be the last question from me, before we turn to the audience. Same question I asked about the distortion benches. Do you think that these also look different now during the coronavirus crisis because of the fragility that you mentioned and the sense of secure foundations tottering around us? Does it seem like weird?
Yeah, I mean, I believe so. Now, not in my specific case, because I feel my days are quite complete, and I'm in a different stage of my life as well. But I'm sure that many people, are self-reflecting and questioning. I mean, I don't have time to question myself these days. I'm very busy with the kids, but yes, I mean, in such times, I'm sure that one self-reflects and loses, losing your life really, because people exist not at necessarily in their homes. They exist with the other people, and we are made to be living collectively and not isolated. So I'm sure that the foundations are disturbed at this specific moment of our life.
And what's also very interesting to me in this image for this particular image we're looking at, in fact, is that it really highlights the extent to which the fragmented pillars both seem like representations of individual people and also representations of a kind of social order in a general sense, like people in general. So on the one hand, you can walk up to a pillar and feel it responding to you as another body in space, but you can also, as I said, not so much think of it specifically as an architectural ruin, but think of it as an image of structure in general, supporting infrastructure in general, having this kind of fragility that maybe we don't always admit to ourselves. And it does feel very, very relevant and poignant in the present moment. Yeah. Let's, if Lucy, if you don't mind going through, we have some great studio shots and process shots to show as well. But if you don't mind going through those while we do the Q&A, is that okay, Najla? Because we'll run out of time otherwise.
Yeah, for sure. Yes.
So, questions. So first, we actually got a couple of questions in advance, including from Ashwini, who I can see is with us. And I wonder whether you want to ask this question or another question. Anything's fair game. Yeah, you're live. Thanks, Ashwini.
So, okay. I still want to kind of know the process behind before you put the two bodies together. Maybe Glenn can read the question. You both have covered a lot about this, about the body and the object and the connection, but I'm so drawn to the Seduction series that I would like to hear a little more about how your mind works, about actually bringing them together. Do you envision them as a whole coming together, or the coming together happens while you're bringing them together? I'm just curious.
But you're talking about production or about concept? I mean, you're talking about the production process?
I think both are connected in yours. I mean, the way you talk about each stone having a specific character, I think material and the concept go together, as I see in your work. So I'll be interested in both.
Well, I mean, I think, well, first is, it's this series represents a specific story. So it's two bodies that do come together. The way I conceive them is that I make models, and these models under my hands come together. Then once they came together, I analyze how they came together. Where are the weights, and where, what's coming out of it. And then in my own memory of two things that come together, and understanding of the logic of things, and of the logic of two bodies coming together, how can I express these, because when two bodies come together, there are specific expressions as well, not about the narrative, but really about what's happening. And because it is in movement, it's not two bodies that come together is not something static, it's something that's in movement. So how am I able to express this to a maximum? So I do dissect that, I do analyze that, and I do that mainly from my models, because you know, because they're made in clay, so I, you know, gravity comes in, so I do understand the expressions at this time. And then in production, it's a different story, because I'm dealing with you know, a block of stone, which is extremely rigid, and which has a different technical process to be able to express that. And well, it's challenging, and I'm lucky enough to be surrounded by I've been surrounded by amazing craftsmen who love challenges, and but it was possible. And even in stone, you know, everything is important. So actually then it's about the relationship that you have with the actual stone, so the way you sculpt it, and the movement that you adopt to sculpt it, and the tool that you're using, and the speed in which you're sculpting, all has an effect on the actual piece and on the expression of that piece, to be able to really go back to the basic, which is my models. So my models are always around me and next to me and close to me, for me to be able to express what I see in them.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Ashwini. Let's move on to a question from June Lee. June, are you with us?
Hello. Hi. I'm quite curious about the Wind Portal, the development from Wind Portal to those series, because to me, the Wind Portal itself looks quite light in terms of the structure and the material, and also the transparency feels even a bit feminine. While for the bench collection and also the other pillar ones, it feels, although even fragilized, it still feels quite solid and quite strong in terms of the base. You always have a strong base. So I'm wondering how volume actually matters to you. Do you think it's maybe a future development for your works from the Wind Portal to the works we saw here? Is it you want to develop more a strong base rather than those kind of very light sort of feeling? How the volume matters to you?
I don't really think about volume as such, and I think you know, going from the VNA Wind Portal to this series, I mean, we discussed it at the beginning. I think it's just a professional journey that I went through, but at the same time, I think they both relate in the sense of the narrative. So the Wind Portal had a specific narrative that was being observed and expressed, and the Transition series has its own narrative that was also observed and expressed. So they join in this way, but you know, of course, volume is important, but then volume becomes meaningful for me within a certain narrative. So I don't see I don't know. I think it's really more of a professional and personal journey rather than yeah. I think I hope I answered your question.
Thank you.
Or not really. Yeah.
I think well, not only did I think you answered it, but I think it also relates to the next question, which is from Jumana El Khoury. Jumana, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Jumana is my sister, by the way. Hey, Jum.
Oh, you can answer any.
Well, it's funny because we never discuss these things, so I'm happy to take the opportunity here. I just had a question for Najla, which is in all the discussion that you've had, the conversation that you've just had, you speak a lot about fragility, and but you still choose to use very strong materials such as stone. And I was wondering if there was a thinking behind that.
Well, it's a good question, June. You know, I mean, no, maybe actually, maybe also this contradiction is important to me because despite the fragility, there is still strength. Now, I don't know if it's necessarily related to all the series. And the seduction, but the seduction doesn't talk about fragility as such. It really talks about something else. Now, for the fragmented pillar, the fragility does come from the material, and although they do appear to be strong and consistent in in their appearance, the materiality of it still represents this fragility in terms of having a material which is not always controllable.
Yeah, so it's sort of relative because you might look at it as a finished object rendered in stone and it looks very, very solid and but when you've actually it can be broken by the wrong strike of a hammer, chisel, and it's much more of a fluid material than you might think. And same with plaster, same with the other materials you're using. Great. Thanks, Jumana. You can discuss later. So one last question from Maurice Asso. Maurice, do we still have you? Maybe not. Maurice, do we have you? Maybe he's having trouble getting on, so I'm just going to rephrase the question in my own terms. Oh, hi, Maurice. He's
hey, Maurice.
Texting.
So Maurice is, I must say, Maurice is he conceived the whole lighting of the V&A and the wind system of the V&A. So I'm happy he's here today.
Well, he's asking a really interesting question, which is how do you conceive the overall evolution of moving from the ephemeral to the object to thought, and this kind of passage in and out of materiality and immateriality?
I don't know. I think I think it's I'm not sure, actually. It's a difficult question to answer. The thing is that projects like the V&A or even other projects that I had that, were just temporary. And now I have a series of objects that are there and that are here to be touched and experienced and that will travel around the world. I don't know. Good question. I'll have to answer that question in a few years, I guess. I don't know. I can't answer that question right now.
That's something that Faye said to us on Wednesday last when we spoke to her, Faye Too Good, that often the meaning of her work became clear sort of 3 years after she made it, But those last pictures that we saw of you working in the stone factory with your collaborators there really bring home the amazing shift in thinking between the kind of physicality of the work and the really strong challenge of getting it to physically exist, and then these very associative, abstract ideas that you're bringing to it. And maybe it's appropriate that we get to finish on this amazing drone video of the stone shop from above, which to me kind of gives you a sense of that bird's eye view and the way that you're sort of lifting out of materiality and then re-engaging with it. Seems kind of poetically appropriate as a concluding gesture. Have you guys been able to get back to Lebanon since moving to the Netherlands?
Once, actually. It was just at the beginning of the outbreak of COVID-19. Yes, once, and after also giving birth to my second child.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe you can fly over there on a drone helicopter.
I wish it could be that easy. I wish.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us today. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you, Glenn, for having me.
Yeah, and it's been a super kind of whistle stop tour through a very complex and sophisticated body of work. I think everybody out there is very curious to see what you'll do next, and I know these ideas will develop further. Just to let folks know, on the other two chats this week, we're going to have Orta Miklos, sort of staying with the Dutch theme because Leo Orta and Victor Miklos are graduates of the Eindhoven Design Academy. So they'll be talking to us about their work in performance and objects. And then on Friday, we have Ron Arad, who you might have heard of, is going to be joining us.
Amazing.
On Friday. And then a week from today, we'll have Libby Sellers, the great London-based design curator. So that's all for today. Najla, thanks again. It's been fantastic.
Thanks, Glenn.
Thanks everyone for listening. And this will be recorded and on the Friedman Bender website eventually, so you can always watch again. Thanks so much.